In February 1943, one of the greatest tragedies in German military history unfolded in Stalingrad, Soviet Union. There, the German army gradually collapsed under the overwhelming pressure of the Red Army in a brutal urban battle that lasted for months. In the final days of the siege, exhausted, starving, and severely wounded, German soldiers became walking skeletons, as recalled by Adalbert Hull, a German soldier, in a secret diary he kept while in captivity. The biting cold made their hands shake so violently that holding a pen was nearly impossible, yet Hull recorded every detail of the horrors he and his comrades endured. On February 2, 1943, more than 91,000 German soldiers finally surrendered to the Soviets. Most of them had survived some of the harshest months in the history of urban warfare, only to face captivity with a fate that was already largely sealed. Within 6 months, about 85,000 of them had died, leaving only around 6,000 survivors. This became the largest prisoner of war disaster in German military history. Immediately after surrendering, German soldiers were stripped by the Red Army of all valuable possessions, from warm clothing and shoes to watches and other personal items. Those who resisted were shot on the spot, while those unable to continue marching were left to perish in the extreme cold. Hull recalled, "We were just walking skeletons. Those who could not continue did not need to be shot. The cold finished them off within minutes." The march from Stalingrad to the transit camps was a grueling ordeal. Survivors, already exhausted after weeks of minimal rations on the battlefield, were forced to walk tens of kilometers in temperatures as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius. Many fell along the way and never rose again. Death was almost constant, not from bullets, but from hunger, cold, and exhaustion. At the train stations, German soldiers endured even harsher conditions. The Soviet rail system, damaged by war and overloaded, prioritized transporting supplies, equipment, and ammunition, while prisoners of war were considered a burden. When trains became available, prisoners were crammed into unheated freight cars designed for cargo, not people. According to former POWs, they had to take turns sitting and even relieve themselves in corners of the cars due to the lack of toilets. Drinking water was scarce, thrown in through the doors, and food consisted of occasional crumbs of bread tossed to them. Walter Ward, a soldier captured in 1944, recounted his experience on the train. "We started with about 5,000 people marching from the front. By the time we reached the station, only 3,500 remained. On the train, we lost hundreds more. Death was always right beside us." One of the most notorious transit camps was Bekovka, near Stalingrad. Originally, it was just shelters and ruined buildings, not prepared to hold tens of thousands of prisoners. Toilets were open pits that quickly overflowed. Drinking water was taken from a polluted river filled with corpses from the battle. Life in Soviet POW camps was a constant struggle for survival. By contrast, Germans captured in North Africa and by the Americans experienced an entirely different reality. They were treated as human beings, not as test subjects or labor to be exploited to the maximum. This starkly highlights the difference in philosophy, purpose, and organizational capacity between the two Allied forces fighting Germany at the same time. Statistics make this difference painfully clear. Of the roughly 3 million German POWs held by the Soviet Union, between 1 and 1.1 million died, a mortality rate approaching 36%. In contrast, of 425,000 German prisoners held by the Americans, fewer than 1,000 died, a rate under 1%. These numbers demonstrate an undeniable fact. A German soldier's survival depended almost entirely on who captured him, a brutal, geographic lottery of life and death. The Soviet philosophy toward prisoners was not simply a matter of logistics or food scarcity. Behind the cruelty was an ideological system. Prisoners were labor to rebuild the economy and instruments of revenge for Germany's wartime crimes. Those unable to work were left to die, a form of natural selection. The Americans, by contrast, viewed prisoners through a lens of humanitarian law, treating them fairly as a testament to the civilization and confidence of a strong nation. From Hull's account, the entire Soviet system functioned like a chain of death stations. From confiscation of belongings, forced marches in freezing cold, overcrowded and unsanitary train transport, to camps where food and medical care were calculated based on labor output. Survival was not merely luck, but an extraordinary struggle against hunger, cold, and disease. In the camps, survivors had to perform hard labor, sometimes under near-death conditions. Work in the Siberian forests, mines, or infrastructure projects was extremely dangerous. Rations were insufficient to survive without labor, turning prisoners into walking skeletons. Hinrich Brandt, a POW who survived 5 years, recalled, "Our bodies consumed themselves. Fat disappeared, muscles wasted away, and eventually organs stopped functioning. Officers were not spared, though occasionally given preferential treatment if deemed useful for propaganda. Some senior officers lived in special camps with better food and conditions, but most endured the same extremities as ordinary soldiers. The Soviets applied international law selectively, depending on political value and economic purpose." Another factor affecting prisoner morale and survival was the ability to communicate with family. In American camps, letters and postcards were sent via the Red Cross, maintaining morale. In Soviet camps, correspondence was largely banned for years. Families were unaware of their loved ones' conditions, adding to despair and feelings of abandonment. Medical care in Soviet camps was virtually non-existent. Disease spread rapidly, and death was inevitable. There were no modern medicines, few doctors, and weak medical infrastructure. In contrast, American camps had fully equipped hospitals, modern medicine, professional medical staff, and even allowed German doctors to learn and practice, improving their skills. In short, the fate of German soldiers at Stalingrad was a lottery of life and death, fortunate if surrendering to the Americans, almost certain death if captured by the Soviets. These experiences were not only personal tragedies, but also lessons on the treatment of POWs, human value, and the philosophy of war. The Soviets chose revenge and exploitation, while the Americans chose humanitarianism and adherence to law. This difference would have lasting consequences for international policy, human rights, and post-war relations between nations. While German soldiers at Stalingrad endured hunger, cold, disease, and almost certain death at the hands of the Soviets, another group of the German army, particularly those in the Africa Corps, experienced an entirely different reality when surrendering to the Americans in North Africa in 1943. The difference was not merely in material conditions, but also reflected humanitarian philosophy, international law, and organizational capacity. In May 1943, after German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered, about 275,000 Axis prisoners, including many seasoned soldiers who had pushed British forces back to Egypt, fell into American hands. From the very beginning, the Americans' treatment left a strong and unforgettable impression. Gerrit Hino Eriksson, a soldier of the Africa Corps, recalled in his memoir, "The Americans gave us water, cigarettes, and chocolate. They apologized for not having full rations immediately, but promised hot meals as soon as possible. We could not believe how they treated their enemy." American soldiers strictly followed the regulations of the Geneva Convention when handling prisoners. Every POW received an immediate health check, adequate food, water, and shelter. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, was notified, ensuring families received news, a luxury German prisoners in the Soviet Union could only dream of. While Stalingrad became a place of death, soldiers in North Africa were safely transported to long-term camps where they received medical care, full rations, and Red Cross supervision. The transfer of prisoners to American camps reflected a philosophy of safety, humanity, and efficiency. They were transported on Liberty ships, the same type that carried American troops to Europe, with beds, 3 meals a day, basic sanitation, and deck time for exercise. The Atlantic crossing took about 2 weeks, but prisoners were well cared for, including medical attention for the sick or wounded. Crew members sometimes even conversed gently with English-speaking prisoners, giving a sense of humanity throughout the journey. Upon arrival in the U.S., prisoners were taken to modern facilities built to military standards but superior to German barracks. Camp Hearn in Texas, for example, could house up to 4,800 prisoners, divided into 3 sections with wooden barracks equipped with electricity, running water, heating, and individual beds. Camp Concordia in Kansas included 304 buildings, a 177-bed hospital, and recreational and educational facilities. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the largest camp in the Southeast, held up to 6,000 prisoners with advanced infrastructure, including electricity, water, and full sanitation systems. Hans Veer, who later became a doctor in Maine, recalled, "We could not believe our eyes. The barracks were better than German military facilities. Each person had a bed with a mattress and blanket, flush toilets, hot showers, and electric lights. These amenities not only ensured health but also preserved dignity and morale." Daily life was another key aspect. In U.S. camps, routines mirrored military life. Roll call at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30 with hot cereal, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Work began at 8 a.m., usually agricultural labor or camp maintenance. Lunch at noon included meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Work continued until 5 p.m., followed by dinner and free time until 10 p.m. Prisoners' rations matched those of U.S. soldiers, about 3,300 calories daily, including meat, vegetables, bread, milk, coffee, and occasional desserts like ice cream. Labor was organized strictly but humanely. Prisoners were not forced into dangerous or military-related work. Officers were exempt. They earned 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which could be spent at camp stores or saved for repatriation. This system addressed wartime labor shortages while giving prisoners purpose and maintaining health. Otto Kraus, working on a Nebraska farm, said, "The farmer treated us like hired labor, not prisoners. We ate lunch with his family, learned American farming techniques, and were trusted with expensive equipment." Medical care in American camps was also superior. Hospitals were fully equipped for regular checkups, chronic illness, and surgery. German doctors had opportunities to practice with new medicines such as penicillin, anesthetics, and drugs unavailable in Germany. Mental health and psychological support were provided, a service German POWs in the Soviet Union never received. Communication with family was another highlight. Prisoners could send 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly through the Red Cross. Mail was censored for military information, but personal content was unrestricted. Letters took about 2 to 3 months to reach families and vice versa, maintaining emotional bonds and morale. By contrast, Soviet prisoners were largely unable to send letters for many years, leaving families uncertain of their fate. The philosophy of labor also reflected stark contrasts. Work in U.S. camps was designed to be useful and safe. Agriculture, camp maintenance, physical exercise, and skill development. In the Soviet camps, labor was punitive. Overwork in dangerous and freezing conditions often resulted in mass deaths. Officers received special treatment in the U.S., separate living quarters, libraries, educational programs, and maintained communication with family. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, about 2,000 officers, including nobles, doctors, and professors, lived under good conditions, had male privileges, and time for research or writing memoirs. In the Soviet Union, only select officers were prioritized for propaganda purposes. Most endured the same harsh conditions as regular soldiers, with smaller rations and no Geneva rights. Repatriation was another key difference. American prisoners began returning home immediately after the war ended in 1945, witnessing liberated camps and Nazi concentration camps firsthand, which helped them understand why the U.S. maintained humane treatment during wartime. They returned to Germany as the country began rebuilding, reintegrating easily with opportunities to contribute to society. Soviet prisoners, by contrast, waited much longer, especially those still healthy. They were retained for labor in rebuilding the country. Some were released in 1947, 1948, while 85,000 were classified as war criminals and not repatriated until 1955-1956 after direct negotiations between West German Chancellor Adenauer and Moscow. Returning home, many were walking skeletons, physically and psychologically scarred, and their families endured years of suffering in uncertainty. This difference was not merely material, but reflected the philosophy and values of the two nations. The U.S. prioritized human dignity, international law, and humane treatment, while the Soviet Union viewed prisoners as exploitable labor regardless of life. These experiences also influenced post-war political perspectives. Former U.S. POWs often became supporters of Western alliances, while former Soviet POWs became strong anti-communist voices. In summary, the experience of German POWs in the U.S. and North Africa reflects an organized, humanitarian, and law-based approach. They received adequate food, medical care, safe labor, maintained family contact, and lived in comfortable barracks. This stands in stark contrast to Stalingrad and Soviet camps, where prisoners endured hunger, cold, disease, forced labor, and near-certain death. These differences not only determined survival, but also had long-lasting political, social, and humanitarian consequences in the post-war world. Looking back on the entire experience of German prisoners of war, POWs, during World War II, the contrast between the Soviet Union and the United States becomes strikingly clear. German POWs at Stalingrad, after surrendering to the Red Army, entered a detention system where human life was barely valued. In contrast, those who surrendered to the Americans in North Africa and the U.S. received careful care, retained their dignity, and even had opportunities to develop skills during their captivity. This difference was not merely a matter of luck, it reflected the philosophy, policy, and wartime thinking of the two nations. In the Soviet Union, German POWs were treated as labor tools. They were considered resources to help rebuild the post-war economy. This was evident in the organization of labor. Prisoners were forced to work continuously in Siberian forests, mines, or infrastructure projects under harsh conditions, sometimes at temperatures as low as -40 degrees, without adequate protective clothing. From transport to transit camps to main detention facilities, everything was designed to extract maximum labor, regardless of life. Those unable to meet labor demands or who were too weak were left to die from starvation or exposure. The horrifying statistics underscore this philosophy. Of roughly 3 million German POWs held by the Soviets, an estimated 1 to 1.1 million died, nearly 36% of the total. Among the soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, about 91,000, only 5,000 to 6,000 survived. This slow death system combined hunger, cold, forced labor, and lack of medical care, making death an integral part of captivity. Even high-ranking officers were not spared, except for a few considered valuable for propaganda purposes. These officers might live in separate quarters with food and reading materials, but only if they agreed to cooperate with Soviet propaganda programs, such as the German National Committee for a Free Germany. Most officers without political value endured the same harsh conditions as regular soldiers, and some had rations reduced if they did not work, forcing them to violate the Geneva Convention just to survive. By contrast, the United States operated POW camps under an entirely different philosophy. The goal was not only to keep prisoners safe, but also to maintain their dignity, health, and morale. Labor in American camps was neither punitive nor exploitative, but an opportunity to remain active, develop skills, and contribute to civilian tasks. A standard workday lasted only 8 hours with Sundays off, entirely safe, and unrelated to direct military purposes. Medical care in U.S. camps was far superior in both equipment and personnel quality. Camps had modern hospitals, routine health checks, disease prevention, and treatment of chronic illnesses. German doctors were allowed to work alongside American physicians, learning new medications and modern methods. Many POWs reported receiving medical care they had never experienced before, even exceeding wartime civilian conditions in Germany. Communication with family was another major difference. In U.S. camps, prisoners could send 2 letters and 4 postcards per month through the Red Cross. Letters generally reached families in 2 to 3 months, providing reassurance and maintaining morale. In contrast, the Soviet Union largely banned correspondence, leaving families waiting for years without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, creating immense psychological pressure. Another strategic factor was repatriation and post-war roles. American POWs were repatriated immediately after the war ended, while Soviet prisoners had to wait many years. Healthy prisoners were retained for labor and reconstruction. Some were released in 1947-1948, and 85,000 had to wait until 1955-1956 for repatriation. This difference not only affected personal lives, but also influenced the social and political reconstruction of post-war Germany. Labor philosophy also diverged sharply. In the U.S., labor was an opportunity, with pay, safety, skill improvement, and morale preservation. Many POWs worked on farms, cultivated crops, harvested sugar beets, maintained forests, or built civilian infrastructure. They earned wages, shopped at camp stores, and saved for repatriation. In the Soviet Union, labor was punitive, dangerous, exploitative, and unpaid, with excessively long hours, meager rations, and harsh working conditions leading to mass deaths. Treatment of officers also reflected this difference. In the U.S., officers lived in separate quarters, had privacy, libraries, educational programs, and opportunities to write memoirs. In the Soviet Union, only officers with political value were treated well. Most endured the same conditions as enlisted men, often violating Geneva rules merely to survive. The long-term consequences of these experiences were profound. American POWs returned to Germany in good health, mentally stable, and many became positive contributors to post-war society, supporting Western alliances. Soviet POWs returned physically depleted, psychologically damaged, with broken families, and faced a divided country. These traumatic experiences became a strong anti-communist influence in West Germany, shaping post-war politics and thought for decades. Another lesson concerns adherence to the Geneva Convention. American prisoners were treated humanely, under regulation, and monitored by the ICRC. The Soviets completely rejected ICRC oversight, concealed detention conditions, and mortality figures, reflecting a totalitarian philosophy where prisoners were resources for exploitation and revenge. This experience contributed significantly to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, including provisions on labor, ICRC oversight, and rapid repatriation. Historical memory also differed. U.S. camps were dismantled, but many left behind symbols, museums, and structures built by the POWs themselves, demonstrating creativity and humanitarian practice in adversity. Soviet camps left almost no trace, only mass graves and painful memories, reflecting how the Soviet government handled history and wartime propaganda. Most importantly, these experiences offer a lesson in human value and strategic impact. Humane treatment not only saved lives but fostered cooperation, trust, and long-term foreign relations. The U.S., by protecting POW rights and dignity, demonstrated that military victory need not be accompanied by brutality. The Soviet Union, by treating prisoners as exploitable labor and instruments of revenge, achieved short-term economic goals but created long-term strategic consequences, breeding resentment and widening geopolitical divides. Personal testimonies reinforce this lesson. Hans Wacker, who experienced U.S. camps, eventually became an American citizen and lived a normal life. Adalbert Hull, who survived 7 years in Soviet camps, carried lifelong physical and psychological scars. The fate of millions of German POWs shows that life or death, recovery or destruction depended not solely on personal luck, but on the choices of nations in treating the defeated. In conclusion, the parallel experiences of German POWs in the U.S. and the Soviet Union provide a historical judgment on national philosophy and ethics in war. The U.S. demonstrated that military strength and humanitarian law can coexist, while the Soviet Union showed that economic exploitation and revenge may yield temporary gains but result in long-term destruction. These lessons remain relevant today for policies regarding prisoners, warfare, and human rights. Ultimately, the story of German POWs reminds us that even in the harshest conditions of war, humanity can exist, and its presence or absence defines civilization. The fate of each prisoner, life or death, depended on the uniform of those receiving them. Red Army blue or U.S. Navy and infantry blue. Yet within that helplessness lies a powerful message. How a nation treats the defeated reflects its character and shapes international relations and historical legacy. In U.S. camps, many POWs not only survived, but had opportunities to study, develop skills, and maintain their mental life. For instance, Camp Concordia offered language classes, encouraged memoir writing, vocational training, and participation in sports and cultural activities. These programs helped prisoners maintain resolve, improve skills, and prepare for post-war life. Soviet POWs, by contrast, faced survival-focused existence, forced labor, lack of food, medical care, and communication. This difference left them returning home physically depleted and psychologically traumatized. Another aspect was relations with surrounding society. In the U.S., POWs were integrated into local communities, working on farms or construction projects alongside civilians. Many were treated as legitimate workers, ate with families, learned American culture, and built close relationships. Soviet POWs were completely isolated from society, living in enclosed camps under strict control, regarded as enemies not only by the government, but also by the broader community. Repatriation policies also reflected national philosophy. The U.S. organized rapid, orderly repatriation, helping POWs reintegrate into post-war German society and contribute to reconstruction. The Soviets retained POWs for extended periods, especially the healthy, for reconstruction labor or classified them as war criminals, sometimes detaining them more than a decade after the war. This had long-term humanitarian and political consequences, deepening anti-communist sentiment and creating lasting East-West tensions. The experience of U.S. POWs also demonstrates that humanity and law do not weaken military or strategic effectiveness. On the contrary, they maintain order, cooperation, and allow prisoners to become positive post-war resources. Well-cared-for POWs remained healthy, mentally stable, and many later served as bridges between cultures. U.S. camps, though built during wartime, became models showing that humane treatment of the defeated has long-term benefits. The Soviet approach, by contrast, prioritized maximum exploitation regardless of human life. Transport by train, forced labor in harsh conditions, lack of medical care and food, and prohibition of family communication created a lethal and indifferent environment. This brutality reflected totalitarian logic. Human life is a tool. Economic efficiency and revenge are paramount. Yet this policy generated long-term strategic failure. Surviving POWs carried resentment, affecting political and social relations for decades. Transparency and international oversight further highlight the difference. The U.S. fully cooperated with the ICRC, allowing inspections and ensuring Geneva compliance. The Soviets entirely refused such oversight, keeping living conditions and death rates secret, not only harming POW lives, but also inciting international disapproval, damaging political credibility. Philosophical differences also emerged in education and prisoner development. The U.S. offered classes, vocational training, and intellectual growth opportunities. Many POWs later applied these skills in post-war Germany or even resettled in the U.S. The Soviet system offered virtually no educational programs. All activities focused solely on forced labor, with no concern for the prisoner's future. The result was that the experience of captivity affected not only health and morale, but also social, political, and historical outcomes. American POWs returned with good health, positive mindsets, and reintegration capability. Soviet POWs returned physically and mentally broken, often becoming anti-communist agents or victims of national division. The lesson is clear. Humane treatment of the defeated is not only ethical, but a long-term strategic advantage. Nations that follow international law, maintain prisoner dignity, and ensure safety, medical care, and education will reap post-war benefits, from societal reintegration to sustainable international relations. Treating prisoners as exploitable tools and depriving them of dignity and life fosters resentment, instability, and long-term strategic failure. Looking back at the contrasting experiences of German prisoners under American and Soviet authority, a clear picture emerges of the character, philosophy, and ethics of these nations. By adhering to the Geneva Conventions and safeguarding the dignity and health of prisoners, the United States not only saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but also created long-term political and social benefits. The Soviet Union, treating prisoners as tools for exploitation and instruments of revenge, caused the deaths of over 1 million people and left lasting psychological and political consequences for decades. These experiences demonstrate that military victory and humanitarian victory are not mutually exclusive. Respecting human rights and the dignity of prisoners does not diminish military effectiveness. On the contrary, it can become a crucial strategic factor. American POWs returned in good health, mentally stable, and many contributed positively to Germany's reconstruction, even serving as cultural and political bridges between the two countries. In contrast, Soviet POWs returned physically depleted, psychologically scarred, with broken families, and became anti-communist actors, reflecting the long-term consequences of treating human lives as exploitable resources. Another important aspect is the impact of prisoner treatment on international relations. By cooperating with the Red Cross, complying with international law, and maintaining transparency in managing POWs, the United States reinforced its global credibility and prepared for a strong post-war Western alliance. In contrast, the Soviet Union refused international oversight, enforced harsh policies, and fostered lasting resentment and mistrust among former POWs and German society, influencing East-West relations throughout the Cold War. This contrast also directly shaped international law on prisoners. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, with new provisions on POW rights, international oversight, and rapid repatriation, largely reflect lessons learned from the brutality of Soviet camps and the humanitarian practices of American camps. Modern nations continue to rely on these principles when formulating policies for the treatment of prisoners and civilians in conflict: dignity, adequate medical care, non-coerced labor, and the right to communicate with family. A profound lesson is the link between humanity and strategic effectiveness. The United States demonstrated that humane treatment not only protects lives, but also fosters long-term trust and cooperation. The Soviet Union, by treating prisoners as exploitable resources, achieved short-term gains but suffered long-term strategic failure, deteriorating relations, widespread resentment, and damage to national reputation. This clearly illustrates that ethical choices in war have tangible strategic value. The story also underscores the importance of reintegration and repatriation. American POWs were repatriated immediately after the war, allowing rapid societal reintegration and contributions to national reconstruction. Soviet POWs, however, often had to wait years, with many only released more than a decade later. This delay not only affected personal lives, but also had lasting social and economic consequences for the country. The experiences of German POWs also serve as evidence of the power of human dignity and the rule of law in shaping history. Those who survived under the Americans became living proof that nations can maintain ethics and legality even in wartime. In contrast, survivors of Soviet camps carried lifelong physical and psychological trauma and became witnesses to the brutality of a totalitarian regime. Multiplied across millions of POWs, these stories shaped collective memory, post-war policy, and societal perspectives in Germany. The narrative of these prisoners raises an important philosophical question. What constitutes true victory? Victory on the battlefield is temporary. Humanitarian, ethical victory, and adherence to international law constitute lasting triumph. By treating prisoners humanely, the U.S. not only gained strategic advantages, but also demonstrated the core values of a democratic nation: strength combined with ethics. The Soviet Union, while achieving short-term economic benefits, left a legacy of hatred and suffering, proving that military power cannot compensate for the absence of ethics and humanity. Viewed from a modern perspective, these lessons remain fully relevant. In contemporary conflicts, the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and the defeated directly affects international credibility, diplomatic relations, and long-term peace. Combining military strength with ethics, law with human dignity, not only saves lives but also reinforces strategic partnerships, builds trust, and opens avenues for lasting cooperation. Ultimately, the experience of German POWs reminds us that humanity and ethical conduct can exist even in the harshest conditions of war. The fate of each individual, survival or death, recovery or trauma, reflects the decisions of the nations that held them. This story is not merely history, it is a message about how nations should act. Choosing humanity, respecting the law, and upholding human dignity shapes the future and creates enduring victories far beyond the battlefield. While the silent mass graves in Siberia remain, small monuments at American camps stand as evidence that even in war, humanity can triumph over brutality. From Stalingrad to Camp Hearn, from Siberia to Texas, the lesson is clear. How we treat the defeated not only defines victory, but also defines civilization and a nation's image on the international stage.